Hello, thank you for being here to learn a little bit about Chapter 4 in Real Estate Principles, the transfer of real estate. I'm going to be going over some high points in the chapter, really trying to bring to life some of the concepts. Hopefully, it will make it less confusing and also bringing out some points that will help you kind of just with some real life perspective with how we're learning about some of these terms and definitions and how they're really applied in the real world. All right, so I'm going to share screen here, go over some notes with you, and hopefully help you understand some of these interesting concepts that we're learning about. The first thing that we're going to discuss in Chapter 4 is the idea of probate. And probate, we just talked about it a little bit in Chapter 3. A lot of times people think about probate or think about what happens when I die when you own real estate, because you might have this idea of, hey, is it going to go to my spouse? Is it going to go to my kids? Well, I don't have any kids, or I don't have a spouse. What's going to happen with this probate? What's going to happen with my money when I die? These are all kind of things that we have to think about, right? As people, everybody dies, right? And so in real estate, sorry to be morbid, but in real estate, when you have assets, when you have things of value, you have to think about this stuff, right? So it comes up in real estate. And first off, here we go. We're talking about probate. So what's interesting about probate is the fact that it's a court process. And so probate basically is a court process, basically the government in some ways controlling what happens to your stuff. So most people think about probate and they think, well, I want to control what happens to my stuff. I don't want to give that control or that decision to the government or to a court, right? And so we have certain things that we might try to put in place to avoid this probate. One is called a will. So the thing about a will is that it's kind of like you being able to express your wishes, okay? So you might write in a will that I want my wife to have all of my cash. I want my kids to have my cars. My collector coin collection, I'm just making up stuff, right? My baseball card collection will go to my nephew, right? This is a will where you actually get to define things of value and tell those people that are still alive after you die what you want to happen with your stuff. Here's the thing though, if you have debts, if I die and I have $100,000 worth of credit card debt and student loans, that money has to get paid off. And so if there's things of value or if there's cash and my spouse can't pay it or my kids can't pay it, the court can actually go through and sell my real estate or sell my stuff to pay off those debts. The will, again, is a direction, it's a wish, it's an ideal. Here's what I want to happen with my stuff. We see a will in a couple different ways. One is called a witnessed will. So this is something that you're planning ahead, you're thinking about. You actually sit down with a witness and they sign saying that they were there. There's probably a notary who's stamping it, saying that yes, in fact, it is Rick Boone who's signing this document. It's witnessed, everybody, it's not a secret anymore. Planning ahead, it has to be done up front. When you die, you either have the will or you don't. There's also another type of will called a holographic will, and that might sound like a joke because you can kind of see through a holograph, right? It's not really there. Well, a holographic will is done more in the moment or just before. You might think of somebody being rushed to a hospital in an ambulance. I grab a pen, I grab a piece of paper, and I start writing stuff down on the paper. I want the house to go to my wife. I want the kids to go, the money to go to the kids. Whatever, I sign it, Rick Boone, in ink on paper. It's actually a legitimate document. It's called a holographic will. And you might think like, well, that sounds crazy. Why would anybody do that? Well, if somebody doesn't have a witnessed will, and maybe, it's an emergency situation. I'm leaving on a flight, first thing in the morning. What happens if my plane goes down? Well, I want to have something that people still alive after I die can read and say, oh, this is what he wanted to happen with the house, with the kids, with the cars, whatever it is. So it's a way for you, even without the foresight, to be able to jot down your wishes in a will called a holographic will. If you die with no will, this term is called intestate. You'll read about it in the chapter. If you die intestate, you have no will, then we have probate. Well, even with the will, you might have probate, but at least there you're kind of dictating what you want to happen. No will, you're basically saying, all right, courts, you figure it out. You decide. Well, the wife wants something, the kids want something, the aunt wants something, the parents want something, and they're all fighting and fighting and fighting. It's the court's choice. And there's, some norms to how they do that. But ultimately, it's up to the court to go through that process and whatever happens and whatever they decide. And then actually probate actually takes a fee as well, right? You're paying the government, the judge, and all that legal stuff. You're paying for that, after you're dead, out of your assets. So it's ideal not to die intestate if you can plan ahead at all. If you have assets, right? If you have cars or house or investments, it's ideal to have it set up ahead of time what you want to do or happen with that stuff. Most people want to avoid probate. There's also a couple different things in the chapter that are mentioned that kind of fall under this heading, which is a little bit weird, but I'll just write some of them down. One's called accession, one's called accretion, and these are different ways that title can be transferred. Chapter 4 is all about the transfer of title. We've got something called adverse possession, meaning like somebody that doesn't own the property is using it. Usually this comes down to occupancy. Accretion's talking about like natural occurrences, like a river, picks up dirt from this side and then it drops it over on this side. And so you have somebody losing dirt, losing land, losing real property, somebody gaining real property. And so again, this comes down to the idea of transfer of real property. And there's too many of these like little unique different ways. All that to say is that, like maybe accretion, maybe you recognize that term, but in real life, transfer of property usually doesn't go down like this. So I don't want you to get too hung up when you're reading through and looking at definitions and reading through examples. Don't get too hung up on all these other ones because there's so many different types of transfer of property in this way. So just don't get too hung up on it. I don't want you to have to your goal is to not memorize definitions in the class. That's not what I want for you. That definition might be on a quiz that you can retake and learn. That definition might be on the final exam for this class, but not too many of those would be on the state exam if you're going to be going for your real estate license. Another type of transfer of property, transfer of real estate, is called eminent domain. Eminent domain is usually thought of in the way of the big bad government is going to come and take my property. Well, so for the legal part of this, for real estate, what we need to understand here is the idea that with eminent domain, the government doesn't want to have to go down this road. The government would much rather buy your property. It's faster, it's less expensive, it's less legal junk that they have to deal with. But eminent domain is actually a legal process. What has to happen for the government is they have to prove that the general population, the general public needs your property more than you do individually. And so that's the first part for eminent domain. It has to be for public use. So, we're going to widen the 22 freeway, the 405, the 5 freeway. We're going to widen it. This is going to benefit millions of local people every day who travel on that highway or freeway. I'm sorry, little homeowner next to the freeway, you're going to lose your property. So it has to be for public use, and there also has to be a payment. And the legal term for this is called just compensation, or I like to call it market value. So typically the government might come in there and say, hey, I want to buy your property for $1 million. And you're like, no way, my property is worth $2 million. And the county or the city or the state says, sorry, your property, we can't pay you $2 million. Will you take 1.1? And the owner's like, no, it's worth 2 million. Well, then we start the court process of eminent domain. And we have this idea of just compensation. Market value for that house is what the government has to pay to the owner. What's tough about that is that the owner has to then take that money and has to find somewhere else to live, right? And so it can be a challenge for people that are in this situation who maybe can't find another suitable house to live in. So eminent domain, again, the two high points that we have to remember about eminent domain, it has to be for public use, and you have to be paid market value, or called just compensation. The next thing I want to chat about with the idea of transfer of real property is called deeds. The deed is the tool that allows this transfer. In chapter 3, I introduced this idea of or to the E. This is another example. We've got the grantor to the grantee, right? This direction of the action or to the E. So without going too far, I'm going to give you some examples of deeds, the most common. I don't want to go down this road. Yes. So for a deed to happen, we have to have very specific requirements on a piece of paper. What's really interesting is that it can actually fit on one piece of paper. If I have this one piece of paper, which has these 7 requirements on them, and I sign it and hand it to you, it's that easy to transfer property. Sounds weird, right? If I have this one correct piece of paper and I sign it and give it to you, we can actually be done. You give me money, we both walk away. So I want to kind of point this out. When we're talking about the transfer of property, it has to happen with a deed. We have kind of, if you will, a step 1. Now in real life, these 2 steps actually happen at the same time. But in the eyes of the law, we actually see this in 2 different ways, in 2 different steps, excuse me. Step 1 is we have these 7 requirements. I don't even want to list off what they are, but it's like a description of the property, description of the person, not a description, but a name, and the vesting, who the property is transferring to, like the buyer. The assessor's parcel number has to be on there. Very specific things have to be on there. 7 requirements. Here's the deal. It has to be signed. So you and I are sitting in the bar, and you say, hey, Rick, are you finally going to sell that property to me? And I say, yeah. Do you have the money? Yeah, here's the 10 grand here in the suitcase. Awesome. Here's my grant deed. I hand you the grant deed. I take your suitcase of money. Are we done? In the eyes of the law? Yeah. Isn't that crazy? So it can be that simple to transfer real estate. It's crazy. The problem with this step 1 is that who knows about it? Now, legally, this is the only step that's required. But who knows about it? You, me, and the bartender, right? And so we have this second step called the acknowledgement and recording. So this is where we often sit down with a notary public. This could be at a mailboxes, like a UPS store or mailboxes, etc., if those still exist, or FedEx now has those locations, right? You go in with your paper and your ID, and the person says, okay, go ahead and sign it, and you sign it, and they go, stamp, you are the person who's on this ID, and you are the person that signed this paper. That's all the acknowledgement is. This is done by a notary. That's it. It's somebody stamping off. It's $10, $15 now. You're paying for somebody to stamp that says you are the person that signed this paper, and that's it. That is what is needed to be recorded at the county recorder's office. So the idea is step one, I'm signing the document. It's legitimate. The property has transferred, but nobody knows about it. So we also have step two, which is the recording. In parentheses, it has to be acknowledged to be recorded. Okay, get it? So really, step one is the only one that's required, but we need, in real life, we got to have step two because that's the public record. That's how everybody knows that you own that property now. All right, so a couple different types of deeds. One is called a grant deed. Again, or to the E, we've got the grantor to the grantee. The grant deed is what we use to transfer property from one to another. So here's what we think about as buyer and seller. Or actually, I'm sorry, let me reverse that. Grantor to grantee, we're talking about seller buyer. Right? Grantor to the grantee. Hear what I'm saying? Grantor to the grantee using the grant deed. Hopefully that's clear for you. Another type of deed is called the quit claim deed. The quit claim deed says, I quit my claim. So where the grant deed actually transfers property from seller to the buyer, the quit claim deed actually removes yourself from title. Why in the world would anybody ever want to remove themselves off of a real estate title? Well, let's say you're fortunate enough to know somebody who just gives you property. They say, hey, here's the grant deed. It's signed. It's yours now. And you say, I don't want this property. I'm going to sign a quit claim deed that says I quit my claim. I do not own this property. Although maybe not realistic in the real world, this is one way that this deed could be used. Another way this could be used, husband and wife are owning the property in community property, and we go to refinance the house, and only the wife has great credit and income. The husband doesn't have credit or income. The wife files or goes through the loan process. The lender has the husband sign a quit claim deed saying, I quit my claim to the property. It's just in the name of the wife for the loan process. After the refinance closes, we can then add that person back on in community property. But for the sake of the loan, the bank needs to see that basically the person signing the loan docs is the one that's responsible for the loan. Quit claim deed, I quit my claim. Another type of deed we hear about is called a trustee's deed. The trustee's deed only happens in foreclosure. And it's what is used from the trustee, who's a third party. We'll learn about foreclosures at a later chapter. But this is the deed that goes from the trustee, a third party, to the new owner. The trustee's deed. When we're talking about title, when we're talking about transfer of real estate in this chapter 4, we have something called a cloud on title. If you remember from my intro stuff, I actually have bought and sold relatively few homes, single family homes. When I was active in the industry, I sold apartment buildings, but I have for myself and my family and some friends have helped people buy and sell some homes. It was one of, gosh, I think there was 2 transactions actually that ended up lasting for months and months. So this example, these are my friends. We're buying a house. We're in escrow. We went through all the walkthroughs. We're great on the loan. It's the farthest transaction that I got in process and didn't close. The lender actually funded the loan And there's only one step after that, and we'll learn about that in another chapter too, the process of escrow. The money was at escrow, and the last step is this recording, and it was discovered that there was a cloud on title. So after months and months of working with these friends, the property fell out of escrow, did not close. I did not get paid a commission. It is so disheartening in this industry when you work not just helping people find property, but actually being under contract on a property and then having it not close is like heartbreaking, because all of that work you don't get paid for. This cloud on title is kind of an interesting thing, because basically it's saying that there's an issue. For some reason, there's an issue on this title that will not allow the title to transfer. And so at any point we see that there's a cloud, it has to be resolved before the property can change hands. Excuse me. So this cloud on title causes an issue because the process of transfer is stopped. All right. So there's a ton of different ways that this cloud on title can come into play, or some examples of a cloud on title. A neighbor's mad at you and files a lawsuit against you and names the property. The owner of the property owes money to somebody and there's a lawsuit. There's money owed to a lender that is not listed on title, creates a cloud. There's a lender that has a trust deed on title, and you're going to sell the property, but the sale is not going to make enough money to pay off that beneficiary, the person you owe money to. Cloud on title. It can be anything that would limit or stop this transfer of real estate, called a cloud. There's one example to kind of close out this chapter. It's kind of a fun example, and I'll walk it through with you after we just learned about deeds and that transfer. Friday night, was out at a bar. This is a pretend story, making this up. Friday night, we're at the bar, and sure enough, I'm talking to this person, and they say, "Hey, Rick, I noticed that for sale sign has been up on your house for months. I've got $10,000 in the car. Are you ready to sell it to me?" And I say, "Sure, Bill, I'll take your 10 grand. And I sign a grant deed and I hand it to Bill and I take his $10,000. Is that a legitimate transfer? Is that a legitimate transfer? Right? It is. I just happen to have the grant deed, in my pocket. Saturday morning comes around, I wake up, start packing up my house. Hey, I'm moving out. And Juan pulls up and says, "Hey, Rick, I've got $10,000 in the car. Are you ready to sell this place?" And I say, "Sure." $10,000. And I sign a grant deed. Is that a legitimate transfer? Now you've got bells going off and red flags everywhere, right? Wait, what? What's happening now? Again, realize what our step is for that deed. Obviously, we have an issue though, right? Obviously, you're like, wait, how can you give another grant deed? Doesn't this person have claim to it or not? It is what it is. So Saturday, I'm boxing up my stuff. I get another 10 grand from Juan, and I give him a grant deed. Sunday comes, and I'm packing up the U-Haul truck, and Bill from the bar moves into the house. Bill says, "Hey, nice to meet you." I say, "Hey, Bill, here are the keys. Have a great retirement in this amazing home for $10,000. Have a nice life." Bill puts his boxes into the house, and I hop a flight to Mexico. Okay. So Sunday night, I'm sitting on a beach drinking margaritas. Monday comes along, and Juan records his deed. right? Remember what we saw up here? Step 2 is the recording. So here's my question to you. Juan records the deed 9 a.m. Monday morning when the recorder's office opens, drives straight to the house, but sure enough, here's Bill, who slept in the house last night. Who do you think should get the property? Pretty interesting, right? So you might think of, when did they sign the deeds? Here's the trick. And again, real life, we have things that are in place to avoid this conflict. Real life, we have escrow that has the grant deed in hand prior to closing. We have escrow waiting for the money from the buyer to come in before they record it. We have escrow working with a title company to make sure that whoever is buying that property with the money from the bank is the one that's on the deed, who then is recording the deed. All this is kind of controlled in the escrow process. Again, we'll talk about that in a future chapter. The idea here, though, is theoretical, and it's based on the law. And here's what you might need to know in concept, in theory, right, for the real estate exam, because again, they're focusing on law and theory. We have Bill moving in. We have Juan recording the deed. Who actually gets the property? It's the first one to do either of these two things. It's the first one to either move in or record. So Juan pulls up to the house. Bill's already living there. Of course, Juan is upset. But in the eyes of the law, because Bill moved in first, possession is a huge part of our legal system. Because Bill moved in first, Bill is the one that actually gets the property, and Juan is out 10 grand, and I'm sipping drinks in Mexico, right? So again, real life, we have checks and balances to keep this from happening. But the idea here is the first one to move in or record. And this just goes to show you too what we just learned about. Step 1 is the signing of that document. That is the one legal requirement to transfer property. It's the signing of that paper. Step 2 is how we tell everybody about it with the recording. And we show the importance here too of possession and the idea of that signed deed, because sitting at the bar with a signed deed, Bill actually was the one that ended up with the property. All right, so I hope that clarifies a little bit about the idea of transfer of property. The tools that we use in talking about different deeds to transfer that property from one to another, or to remove yourself from that deed. The steps that are required with the grant deed, particularly, and the idea that when we sign a document, that's the important step. But of course, we have to record it to make it public knowledge. The functions of eminent domain and the steps of eminent domain. The top two being, of course, public use, and the owner must be paid just compensation. And with probate, this being a court process and basically the handling of somebody's assets after they die. Of course, you're going to read about these concepts and a lot of these definitions through the chapter, but hopefully this will bring to light and a little bit of explanation behind the terms, a little bit of real life understanding about how they work. Thanks for being here tonight, and happy to answer any questions for you. Thanks for being here.